Good morning, class. Today we're going to be talking about human development. Um, I will be seeing you again on Friday, and thank you for being flexible with me taking this time and posting this YouTube video up. So a couple of things now. Every once in a while I'm going to be looking over so that I can look at the PowerPoint. When I meet with you on Friday, I'll go through some of the videos that I have with the PowerPoint. So this isn't going to take a full 45 minutes, but my expectation is that you will have seen this, you will have downloaded the PowerPoint prior to going through this lecture, and then we'll be up to date when we get together on Friday again. So first of all, what we're going to look at are the stages of development. Now hopefully I don't have to go through the birds and the bees with you, and you certainly understand how that whole thing works. But when a sperm unites with an ovum or an unfertilized egg, what happens is there's the resulting zygote. The zygote is the union of those two. It is the initial cell that is formed with those two, usually within about 3 hours of conception. What has happened is the sperm the head of it has dissolved, it has released the chromosomes, and then the 23 pairs of chromosomes unite in the fertilized egg at this point. So that is known as the zygote. It takes place usually in the fallopian tube. Now this could be a problem because what's supposed to happen is in the next 3 days to maybe 1.5 weeks, the zygote is supposed to make its way down the fallopian tube and implant in the uterine wall. As soon as that happens, then that is the beginning of the embryonic stage. Okay. However, every once in a while, what happens is that there is an implantation of the zygote in the fallopian tube, that it doesn't make its way all the way down the fallopian tube. And usually this is going to go unnoticed by the woman until she begins to feel pain. So when she feels pain, she goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, this is what is called an ectopic pregnancy. That is when the zygote has implanted in the fallopian tube. As a result then, unfortunately, that pregnancy needs to be terminated. Otherwise, what will happen is the embryo will begin to get larger, and as that happens, it can rupture the fallopian tube and cause internal bleeding, and literally the woman can bleed to death. So it's extremely important that something along those lines gets taken care of immediately so that that doesn't happen. The sperm is either going to contain X or Y chromosomes. This is going to determine the sex of the baby. I always found it funny when I've had patients already that would come in and blame the guy would blame his wife for having all boys or all girls or something along those lines, when in reality it's the guy's fault. Okay, because the woman's ovum only contains X chromosomes. So what happens when you get an X and a Y together is there's going to be a boy. When you get an X and an X together, it's going to be a girl. And if you get two Ys together, nothing's going to happen because that's two sperm. Approximately 200 million sperm are ejaculated. If there are 60 million, I think I said 200 million, right? I didn't say just 200. But anyways, 200 million sperm. If there are 60 million sperm or less, it could suggest that the male is impotent, and there may need to be something that's done. 46 chromosomes are what are going to be ultimately together in the zygote. That's 23 pairs. 23 chromosomes are going to come from the mother, and 23 chromosomes are going to come from the father. And these chromosomes determine what is known as the genotype, and we'll be talking about that in just a few moments. So then the germinal stage is the zygote implants in the uterine wall, approximately 3 days to 1.5 weeks. This is after the zygote has been formed. And then what's going to happen is after the implantation, then that is known as the embryonic stage. And I'll talk about that a little bit further in just a moment. So looking at the genotype and the phenotype. The genotype is the genetic makeup. So when I'm talking about the chromosomes, and we're looking at all the guanine and the adenosine and all the amino acids that go together to make up DNA, that is the person's genetic makeup. However, what will happen after that is that when the person is born, as the person appears to other people, that is known as the phenotype. And I was just overhearing a lecture by Professor Evans, and she was talking about Mendel and the peas and the genetic research that he had been doing on the outcomes of dominant and recessive genes, and that would appear as far as what color the flowers were for the peas, how the peas would look, etc., etc. So that is the phenotype, the outward appearance. So what you and I see of each other, that's the phenotype. But our actual genetic makeup is known as the genotype. So it's important for you to know the difference between those two terms. Now, sometimes what will happen is that the fertilized egg might split into two fertilized eggs. When this happens, the chromosomal makeup of each fertilized egg is identical. This will result in identical twins, also known as monozygotic twins. Sometimes what will happen is more than one egg could be released. This is especially often happens when there are fertilization treatments, that a woman is having difficulty getting pregnant or something along those lines, and so she's injected with a medication that causes a number of eggs to be released or ova to be released, and when this happens, it's possible for more than one ova to be when you hear that, that's my clock in the background. So every once in a while, depending on how long this lecture goes, you may hear that a couple of times. So when more than one is fertilized, it can result in multiple births. These are known as dizygotic twins. They are the same as a brother and a sister, or two brothers, two sisters, but don't necessarily share the same genetic makeup. Okay, so it's important to know the difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Also, when human beings develop, are you ready for this? This is another one of those that you can amaze your family and friends. Remember we talked a while back about gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA? All right, well, here's another term that you can use. Human beings develop cephalocoidally and proximodistally. Cephalocoidal development means from the head down. So what's going to happen is the cells that are going to differentiate and begin to develop are those that are responsible for the head. And basically, remember, the brain is the operations center and is telling everything else what to do. Okay? Then human beings also develop what is known as proximal distally from the inside out. And so the organs are going to form first, and then the skeleton, and then the muscles, and then finally the skin is going to develop over top. So it's going to develop that way. So that when an infant is born, you'll notice something, that the head is much larger proportionally to the rest of the body than in an adult. So the head is approximately, I'm going to say, 1/3 of the overall size of the body. It's much larger. However, as we grow into adulthood, our bodies grow into more of a proportion, so that our head is about, I'm going to say, somewhere around 1/7 to 1/8 the size of the head, or I mean of the rest of the body. And then we develop from the inside out. So when babies are first born, while they have what's known as gross motor movement, they can move their arms and their legs and everything, they don't have what is known as fine motor movement. In other words, they can't pick up objects with their hands, they can't walk, they can't do those kinds of things. This is because the muscles are developing from the inside out. And so as they develop, then children will be able to do more of those fine motor skills. So there you go. Human beings develop cephalocoidally from the top down and proximodistally from the inside out. So in utero development then, we've started out with the zygote. We've moved into the germinal stage, which is about 3 days to about 1.5 weeks, somewhere around that neighborhood. And then from about 2 weeks to 8 weeks, this is known as the embryonic stage. And then from 9 weeks until complete gestation, which is usually around 39 to 40 weeks, that's known as the fetal stage. Now, human beings also develop, as far as perception is concerned. And remember, perception, now we're talking about our senses. Some of the senses develop fully in utero, and other of the senses wait until after we develop, outside of the womb. So, for example, hearing develops about, I'm going to say, 6 months, 24 weeks into the pregnancy. So if you've ever been swimming and you dive underneath of the water, you can still hear what's going on outside while you're under the water, but it sounds garbled. Well, that's what's going to happen as far as a baby is concerned, because a baby is hearing the outside world through the mother's amniotic fluid that's surrounding the baby. So it's going to sound a little bit muffled and that kind of thing. It used to be thought that if you read to your baby in utero, and if you play music, like Bach and Beethoven and some of the classical artists, that your baby is going to be smarter. Well, research really hasn't borne that out. However, what research has found, that let's say that you have a particular type of music that you like to listen to, and you listen to that a lot, your baby will probably enjoy the same kind of music after he or she is born. So if you're really into Nine Inch Nails, which I realize that's an older group, Pink Floyd has made a resurgence, so we can use Pink Floyd, or Led Zeppelin or something, and now we're getting back into my era, but some of these have come around again. Then your baby is probably going to enjoy that type of music as well. Okay, so that's really what's happening there. So hearing does develop in utero, and the baby's able to hear in utero. As far as vision is concerned, baby is able to follow light and dark in utero. However, it really doesn't begin to fully develop until after the baby is born. So at birth, then, for the first few days, the baby can still follow light. From about birth up until age 4 months, then, the baby is able to see very close. So we're talking, and I'm talking clearly now, so we're talking about a foot and a half away from the baby. However, this is extremely important, because when the baby is nursing, when you're feeding a baby, how far is the baby away from mom or dad's face? About a foot to a foot and a half. So what's going to happen is the baby is going to intently stare at the mother or the father, whoever's feeding the baby, and really is taking in the features of the mother or father during that feeding time. Prior to that time, the way the baby is going to be able to identify, especially mother, is through the sense of smell. So babies are able to sense and smell their mothers and identify their mothers based on their smell prior to being able to visually identify their mothers. So, excuse me. So, remember how we talked, now I'm going to go way back, when we were talking about the brain and we were talking about the limbic system, that the sense of smell is hardwired into the limbic system. The limbic system, in part, is our emotional system, and there are other things that our limbic system does as well. So this is extremely important, because that is helping to keep the baby alive in the beginning of his or her life, being able to identify mom and being attracted toward mom, which is the food source. Okay, I'm not trying to be funny here or whatever, but that's the baby's sustenance. That's the baby's food source, as well as psychologically being able to bond with the mother, and that's extremely important. So at about 3 months, the baby is able to discriminate colors. Okay, and then by 4 months, the baby is able to see distance as well as close up. Now, it was thought for the longest time that the cues for depth, in other words, being able to see a drop-off. So you're on a step and you can tell that there's a step that goes down further or whatever, that will be known as visual spatial identification and depth perception. It was thought that this depth perception occurred about age 6 months. And this was because an experiment was done with what is known as a visual cliff. And I'll be showing the video on Friday of a visual cliff. The visual cliff is basically a glass top table, and on part of the glass top table there's a checkerboard design that is painted, and then the checkerboard design continues on the floor underneath another section of the glass top table that is clear. What researchers did with babies was they would put the baby on the one side where the checkerboard was, and the mother would go on the other side and try to coax the baby over onto the clear glass. Might use a toy, baby's favorite toy, calling to the baby, whatever. And the baby would go to the edge of the painted glass and then become rather upset, not want to move, that sort of thing, onto the clear glass, because the baby was able to see, oh my goodness, there's a drop off there, and the baby would become rather anxious. So it was thought by researchers, and by the way, this was errant, it was thought by researchers that, oh my goodness, depth perception develops by the age of 6 months. However, what they were not taking into consideration is at age 6 months, this is when babies are able to first crawl. What about prior to age 6 months? Do they have depth perception prior to that period of time? However, researchers weren't taking that into consideration. So this research was done later, and what was found, and what they did was they hooked up heart monitors to the baby, and when they took the baby across that line onto the clear glass, there was a change in the baby's heartbeat. In other words, the baby was noticing that there was a difference. This would indicate that depth perception had developed, and they were able to find as early as 4 months that depth perception had developed. However, the difference is the babies did not become extremely anxious, which makes sense to me, and this wasn't necessarily in the research, but makes sense to me because, let's face it, when a baby first learns to crawl, they're going to fall. They might fall off of a step, they might just simply, as they're crawling along, do what I call a face plant, whatever the case is, and so they will become anxious with the idea that there is a drop-off. However, the baby prior to age 6 months that doesn't have that experience is not going to become anxious. They'll notice a difference, but they won't become anxious. So at least I found that interesting. Hopefully you will as well. So that's the visual cliff, and like I said, I'll show you a video of the visual cliff on Friday when we get together again. So nasal preferences are well established at birth. Taste preferences, they're able to differentiate between sweet and sour. If you want to do an interesting little experiment that won't hurt the baby, what you can do is take a little bit of sugar, put it on the end of your finger, and put it to the baby's tongue, the baby's mouth, and the baby will get very excited and begin sucking. However, if you take a little bit of lemon juice, unless of course the baby has a preference for lemon juice, but you take a little bit of lemon juice, put it on there, and the baby will make funny faces because the baby's going to know that this is sour. Okay, so those develop also early on and, at birth. The pain threshold also develops at birth. Okay, and what researchers have found is the children that are born vaginally as opposed to cesarean section seem to have a higher pain threshold than those that are born cesarean section. So what they think is that since it is extremely stressful being born vaginally, it causes the release of many more endorphins, and this helps the baby to tolerate pain. Whereas if the baby is born cesarean section, the baby doesn't go through that same kind of stress, therefore endorphins aren't manufactured and released nearly as much, and so the baby has a lower pain threshold. So what that means then is a higher pain threshold is they can handle more pain than the lower pain threshold. Also, when a baby is first born, there are a number of reflexes, and I have some listed on your PowerPoint. The video that I'll be showing on Friday demonstrates a few more. The reflex that I really want you to know is what is known as the rooting reflex. What happens is if you touch the cheek of a baby, the baby is going to turn his or her head and begin a sucking motion. Once again, this is in order to so that the baby will feed. Okay, so it's one of those inborn reflexes so that the baby is going to be able to sustain life. Some of the others are known as the Palmer reflex, the Babinski reflex, and like I said, those reflexes are going to be in the video that I'll show you on Friday. However, the rooting reflex is the one that I really want you to know. And what am I looking for here? To put in your memory store. Okay, remember the stages: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Well, encode that information, store it, but make sure that you can retrieve it. Okay, we also look at, as far as human development is concerned, what really has more of an impact on human development. Is it the genetic makeup, or is it the environment into which the child is born? And so it gets into what is known as a nature versus nurture controversy. This has been going on, folks, for years. And some people come down solely on genetics, other people come down solely on environment. Bottom line is, others seem to take that both of them are working on each other. So the genetic makeup impacts on the individual as well as the environment, and depending on their genetic makeup, that really has a great deal to do with how the human being develops. So behavior genetics is the study of the relationship between the genetic and environmental influences. And in order to determine a lot of these things, they look at adoption studies. These adoption studies, especially when they're looking at identical twins, which are also known as, indeed you're right, monozygotic twins. Why does one twin develop a certain disorder and the other does not? Or do both twins develop the same disorder? Because remember, with monozygotic twins, they have the same genetic makeup. And so, is it genetics? Is it environment? As far as psychology is concerned, there are 4 disorders that really seem to have a genetic component. Now, genetics are not entirely responsible for these disorders, but they seem to add to the possibility of developing these disorders. So schizophrenia is one, major depressive disorder is another, bipolar disorder is a third, and then finally alcoholism or alcohol dependence. So it seems as though then if there's a genetic loading, in other words, mother or father or both, maybe grandparents, aunts, uncles, someone in the family tree has one of these disorders, it increases the likelihood. However, it is possible the person will never develop that particular disorder unless something else happens to them, and there are other factors, environmental factors, that may contribute then to them developing the disorder. What this is known as is the diathesis stress model. What this means is that there's a genetic predisposition. However, it could also then, because of certain environmental factors, cause the person to develop the disorder. Whereas if those environmental factors were never there, they may never develop the disorder. Okay, so just keep that in mind, the diathesis stress model. Temperament is another area, okay, that seems to be an inherited trait. In other words, it is genetic. The video that I'll be showing you on Friday has to do a great deal with temperament then, and is looking at emotional reactivity. How does an infant react to his or her environment? React to strangers, react to new situations, react to getting changed, diaper getting changed or feeding or whatever. So some research has looked at 3 basic types of temperament. One is what is known as the easy child. With the easy child, this is the one that's kind of laid back. Here I am, world. Everything is okay. When they get into a new situation, now I have to sit back up again. when they get into a new situation, they pretty much take it in stride. There's no problem. If you pass the child from one person onto the next, they don't seem to have any difficulty with that, and everything is okay. Then there is the difficult child. This is the one that with any kind of change in routine or whatever, they become extremely upset, and it is very difficult then to quiet that child down. Whenever strangers are introduced, they cling to parents. They don't want to go with the stranger. They don't want to be handed off. Can be very fussy and that kind of thing. Then there's the slow to warm up child, which is sort of in between the two. The slow to warm up child begins with being kind of fussy and not wanting to change, not wanting to go with another person, but then after a period of time warms up and then will go with the other person, or may become acclimated to whatever's going on and be fine and very secure and no problem. So easy babies, those are the ones that are the easiest ones to deal with. Now it's suggested, as far as temperament is concerned, that whatever temperament we're born with, this is what we carry throughout our entire lives. So if you were an easy baby, then you're going to be kind of laid back in new situations and everything as far as the rest of your life. If you were slow to warm up when changes happen, you have a difficult time at first, but then you can acclimate. And for the difficult babies, whenever change happens, it is extremely difficult for you, and it takes an extended period of time for you really to then become acclimated. Eventually you will, but it takes a very long time for that to happen. So it is suggested that these three are the building blocks for personality. But what you'll see in the YouTube video that I'll be showing you later regarding temperament, you'll see that there are at least 7 others. And actually, we'll look at the alternative model for temperament on the next slide. On the PowerPoint, I have some of these. So sensitivity is one of them, and how much the baby notices slight sensations. Remember back when we were talking about absolute threshold? Okay, and if you will recall, absolute threshold is when you can sense through your one of your 5 senses that stimulus at least 50% of the time. Okay, so it's the candle 30 miles away on a dark night. At least 50% of the time you'll be able to see that candle that is flickering, that flame. All right, so how much can a baby notice slight sensations? Some babies are much more sensitive to touch or to sound, startle reflex, those kinds of things, than other babies. So that's sensitivity. Activity. How much bodily movement? Some, once again, are relatively laid back. They're not, I'm not going to say they're sluggish, but they're not really real active during the day or whatever, or during routine events. Others are very active, and the arms and the legs are going, and they're looking all around, and they're very active. The intensity, the volume of emotional reaction. Oh my goodness, my youngest grandson, Braden, I was taking one of the kids for a horseback ride, and we were a couple of acres away, and I could still hear Braden a couple of acres away. His voice was just, he's the loud kid. He's much louder than any of the other kids, except for his brother. His brother has a tendency to speak very loudly as well. So that's the intensity. Adaptability, and that gets back into the slow to warm up, the easy, and the difficult child. So how easily does the child adapt to new situations? Approach and withdrawal is looking at how does the child really go to other people. Some children very easily will go to another person. Other children really kind of cling to the parents and really don't want to go to another person. So the initial response to new people, places, and things. Predictability. Regularity. Oh my goodness, it is so nice to have a child that's regular, so that you can tell when they get hungry, when they take a nap, when you have to change their diaper. There are some children that are not regular, and their nap time isn't regular or whatever, and that really can play havoc on the parent. Okay, so it's important to understand the child's routines and get them into a routine. And then finally, persistence is basically how quickly does a child drop an activity when there's they encounter some sort of resistance. So will they persevere? Will they continue? Will they persist? Or will they just kind of let go and stop and do something else? So really those are seven, in the alternative model, those are 7 different areas. Other effects on human differences, early stimulation. Now, as we've already found out, and as we talked about in memory, that stimulation is important in learning. And so what happens is, as we stimulate a human being, the human being is going to grow new connections. Remember, we talked about long-term potentiation, and we also talked about growing those new connections. And all those things are extremely important. So it is important with an infant for them to have a great deal of stimulation. Now, not overstimulation, but stimulation, and that helps in brain development. Parents, some other effects on human differences, the parents' education, how they discipline the child, how they teach responsibility, how they teach orderliness, ways of interacting with authority figures, how the parent interacts with authority figures. So, for example, modeling that's taking place. Children are sponges. They pick up on these kinds of things. And what is the living environment like? Is it challenging? Is it warm? Are parents accessible? All those kinds of things. With peers are going to affect human differences as well. And so, is there a great deal of peer interaction? Do you keep the child away from peers? What kinds of things are the peers teaching the child? And that kind of stuff. And the culture, which includes behavior, it includes attitudes, it includes rituals that people go through. Think about during holidays. How do your families spend your holidays? What kind of rituals do you engage in? What are some of the rites of passage within your culture? So, when a child turns 15, 16, 18, 21, when a child turns 13, those kinds of things. What happens as far as your culture is concerned? And what are these things that are passed down from one generation to the next? Now, culture, by definition, and I'm just going to read this straight up off of the PowerPoint, behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. So each culture has a certain set of norms. These are rules by which we are to live that govern our behavior. Things that are appropriate to do, things that are inappropriate to do. There is personal space within our culture. A dear friend of mine likes to get up really close to my face when he talks to me. And for him, that is his personal space. Here in the United States, and it's going to be hard for you to see on the video here, but approximately 1 arm's length away from another person, if we are not intimate with that person, is considered appropriate personal space. Have you ever stopped to think about why people stop talking when they get into an elevator? And the reason for this is people begin to feel uncomfortable because other people are invading, that they don't know, are invading their personal space. And as a result, they will withdraw and they'll get more quiet. Once they get out of the elevator and are allowed more personal space, then they'll begin to talk to other people because now they're feeling much more comfortable. Expressiveness. There are some cultures that have a great deal of expressiveness, others that really do not. So, for example, and now I'm going to pick on some individuals, not individuals, but a culture, if we talk about the Pennsylvania Dutch, okay, which is prominent in Berks County and Lancaster County. In the Pennsylvania Dutch, expressiveness is not valued. They're considered much more of a stoic culture. Keep things inside, keep things to yourself. Don't outwardly express those unless you're with family. But to the outside world, don't express a great deal. Then there are other cultures where expressiveness is quite expected. okay, and is loud. So you'll go to some family gatherings and oh my goodness, they're fighting and they're very loud and boisterous and people are talking over each other, and yet that's accepted within that culture. The pace of life. We can even look at that here in the United States from the south to the north. Here in the north, we have a very fast pace of life. In the south, it is much more laid back, much quieter, much slower pace of life. Up here, if we don't have, as soon as we're finished with our appetizer, we don't have our salad. As soon as we're finished with our salad, or practically, we don't have our entree. And then they should be coming over and should be constantly refilling our drinks, etc., etc. If we're out in a restaurant, we say, oh my gosh, that service is so slow. And yet if we go down south or we go to another country, for example, if you go to Italy, it may take 3 hours for you to eat a meal. And that is expected. Now there are many more courses there, but there's also time for you to sit and talk to other people. It's much more of a social event. There are variations over time in each culture. So cultures can change. Things can change within the culture. There's individualism versus collectivism. Here in the United States, we value the individual. However, in other cultures, they value the family or the society or whatever. And so therefore you wouldn't do anything against other people because it might cause them harm. Whereas here, I'm the most important person. That's the individualistic culture. Child rearing is different in different cultures. There are different expectations of what children should do, how they should behave, how they should respond to authority figures, etc., etc. And so child rearing is much different in different cultures. That is going to bring us to talking about human development. Now we're going to get into cognitive development. We'll be looking at Jean Piaget and his stages of development and that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do, it's been 37 minutes into this lecture. There hasn't been any give and take. I've been a talking head for you. And so I'm not going to subject you to any more during this. But we're going to finish up human development on Friday the 15th when we're back in class. I certainly hope that you have gotten something out of this. The nice part about the video is you're going to be able to play it over and over again if you want to. Oh my goodness. And this is going to be on the YouTube channel, so you'll be able to play it more than once and get anything that you missed. The PowerPoint is going to be available also online, so on Angel, so you'll be able to download that as well. All right, have a good day, and I will see you on Friday. Take care now.